Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. We're bringing you the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Yin Khvat. In today's show, we look at the latest semiconductor news, from Micron slashing jobs to China's $143 billion stimulus package and the Dutch and Japanese aligning with Washington's historic export controls on China. Joining me in the studio today are Dr. Ming-je Tang, Gung University President and former National Taiwan University Professor, and Roy Lee, Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research, Taiwan WTO Center Deputy Director. And earlier, our political editor, Rath Wang, spoke to Hong Wei, the mayor of Cupertino in the US state of California, who was born and raised in Taiwan. She was a postgraduate of University of California, Los Angeles, and a graduate of National Taiwan University in Foreign Languages and Literature. President Tang, Professor Lee, a very warm welcome to the show today. We begin today with the chip slump and news that US-based semiconductor maker Micron has announced a 10% staff reduction and suspended bonuses. Taiwan Plus's Bing Wang and Kama Xu find out what's behind it all in our first report.
These engineers in hazmat suits are making sure this semiconductor plant runs smoothly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. More than 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are produced right here in Taiwan. They end up in all types of tech, from smartphones and personal computers to cutting-edge fighter jets. 2020 saw the beginning of a global semiconductor chip shortage because of production holdups and supply chain issues. This was in part due to the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As such, for most of the past 2 years, demand for chips has been extremely high. But things are starting to change. The world is gradually emerging from the COVID pandemic. As it does, many are feeling a sharp financial pinch from rising living costs and inflation. Because of this, people are more hesitant to purchase pricey electronic goods. This means there's now a chip excess, and semiconductor prices are dropping. At the current rate, experts believe chip prices could fall by more than 10% in the first quarter of next year. Taiwan Mask Corp, a major semiconductor manufacturer, is one of the companies most heavily affected by this shift in the market.
虽然现在世界情势还有经济的局势蛮挑战的哈，其实光照也有感受到，但是我想光照今年当初原先所编列的一些计划仍然能够如实的去执行，那我想仍然是一季比一季好。
But analysts believe demand will eventually recover and begin to rise again by next year, especially with increasing global reliance on digitalization, 5G, and artificial intelligence technologies.
我想大部分的厂商其实都有一些共识，在明年的第一季跟第二季，产业其实会慢慢的回温。
For now, though, the looming financial fallout is a very real and very serious issue for Taiwanese chip makers. Semiconductors account for almost 40% of Taiwan's exports. If demand for chips stays low, this could make a significant dent in the country's economy. Kama Xu and Bing Wang for Taiwan Plus.
That was Kama Xu and Bing Wang reporting. President Tang, total chip sales in 2023 expected to shrink 4%. There's also the Micron layoffs, as we mentioned. So how significant is this slump?
I think this is a repeated history of year 2000. If you are young enough, you should remember Y2K. During the 1999, there was a huge demand for semiconductor chips because everybody has to replace the old PC. So at that year, chip demand has increased by 36%, and then flat for another 3 years. So in fact,
because last year was a 26%
last year we had
we
got 26% increase.
That's right.
For the semiconductor industry. So I would expect for being flat for another 2 or 3 years. Because I did some calculations. The compound growth rate for semiconductor chips from 1990 to 2018, the compound growth rate is only 6%. So if you experience 26% increase in a particular year, you would expect there will be slowdown in the next 2 or 3 years. So the slowdown is not 1 year. It's probably is going to last for 2 or 3 years.
That's bad news, Professor Lee, for Taiwan's chip industry, if it's going to take another few years before it bounces back.
Yeah, but there are also other estimations. McKinsey, the consulting company, expect the total sale of chips will be over 100 billion US dollars by the year 2030. That is about 8 years from now. Their estimation is based on the demand growth. For example, for electric vehicles, the demand for chips is maybe 100 times larger than traditional engine cars. So, and also all these new applications. But I fully agree with President Tang that because of the very distorted last year, we're going to see a kind of normalizing the chips supply on the supply side, and of course decline of growth is something that cannot be avoided.
President Tang, Professor Lee mentioned cars there, and of course we know that the chips used in cars are actually at the lower end. Is it possible that Taiwan will still see growth because it's the higher end chips that are still in high demand?
High-end chips have been always in high demand, but the market is only 10 to 20% of the whole market. So even though we see high growth in maybe 2 nanometers, 3 nanometers chips, however, the total demand will not increase that much. And also, chip industry is so great in reducing the size and in combining different chips into one, and therefore, you see the 6% compound growth rate from 1990 to 2018. I was a little bit surprised. How come so low? That's nominal dollar, not constant dollar. If you really want to calculate constant dollar, the number is even less. Why? Because technological advancements. Technology has improved a lot, and our design industry and the manufacturing industry, they are doing excellent job to combining chips into one. So there was a demand for 3 chips. Now 1 chip can do the same function as the 3 chips. As a result, as you can see, their own success will reduce their own demand.
Victim of their own success. Let's talk about electric vehicles, because in a traditional combustion engine car, there's about 1,000, 1,200 chips. In a electrical vehicle, fully electric vehicle, possibly about 3,000. Do you see this as an amazing growth market?
Yes, I agree. It's going to be a great market because we produce 80 million cars per year. Now we have only 6% electrical vehicle. So by year 2035, probably there will be half of the automobile output will be electrical vehicle. So that will be 40 million, assuming no growth. And suppose now each car will cost $30,000, and the amount of the chip in each car will cost you 20% of the whole cost. That will come down to a very, very large number. Last time I did some calculations. I think the number is at the range of $200 billion or something. So that's a huge market.
Professor Lee, and let's also talk, again, staying on the automobile market, how about autonomous vehicles? This would then provide another surge in demand for the high-end chips.
Of course, it's all about computing capacities. It's about calculation of direction, distance, and the dimension, the relationship between different dimensions. So you're talking about a computing device with 4 wheels driving on the car with the electric battery. So the demand will be growing. But as Professor Tang just mentioned, right now, automotive sectors only accounts for about 8% of the chips demand. It will be increased to somewhere between 15% in the next 8 to 10 years. But still, it's not the most important demand source. The most important demand source still come from computing, storage,
iPhones.
Yes, smart ICT products. So it's really, the growth is there, but it's probably not sufficient to offset the decline of growth that we'll be witnessing the next 3 years to come.
Okay, thank you. Still to come in the show, the US government's defense bill, or National Defense Authorization Act 2023, was passed by US Congress on December 8th, and for the first time it bans Chinese semiconductor companies such as SMIC and Yangtze Memory. We take a look at the impact for China's chip industry. But first, while the Dutch and Japanese governments have agreed in principle to align with Washington's strictest chip export controls on China, this man, Peter Wennink, the CEO of Dutch semiconductor equipment maker ASML, says his company has already sacrificed, referring to restrictions dating back to 2019 on selling its most advanced lithography machines to China. He says this has benefited US companies selling alternative equipment. Professor Lee, that was Peter Wennink, ASML CEO. How important is it for the US to get the Dutch and the Japanese on board?
Now we understand that for the semiconductor sector, there are several segments, each of which have dominating or important players that are dominating the supply and demand of that segment. For example, TSMC is dominating the contract manufacturing side, whereas ASML from the Netherlands and also Nikon and Canon from Japan are the dominating or the leading firms for the equipments that are needed for manufacturing of chips. And some of the US companies are the leading companies who are supplying advanced materials that are needed, and also softwares for the design of the semiconductor. So that's the distribution of, let's say, professions or distribution of leadership across these different countries. Now, for the US, if they want to ensure to maximize the effectiveness of the export control regime they put in place in October this year, they need collaborations from all the leaders from these different segments of the semiconductor sector.
For it to be watertight.
Yes. So, for example, in the part of manufacturing equipments, currently, these three companies, ASML from Netherlands, Canon plus Nikon from Japan, dominates about 90% of the global share. For advanced manufacturing equipments, ASML is probably the monopoly for that part. So without ASML or Nikon or Canon to participate, you will see a big loophole in terms of China's being still able to access to manufacturing equipment that are necessary for China to advance or elevate its technology level from the mature node of the manufacturing into the advanced part. So it will be necessary as contingent, very important contingent measures to the export control regime.
And what do you make of Wennink's comments about how essentially he's saying it's unfair because, you know, since 2019, his company has been restricted from selling their advanced equipment, but they're saying alternative equipment is being sold by US companies.
Absolutely. I think before that, we need to understand that there's a very unique feature of the export control regime in the United States. The regime in general applies only to US-based companies, but ASML definitely is not a US company. Same is Nikon or Canon, and also TSMC. All these foreign companies are collaborating with the US and also putting their products subject to the export control because this special provision in the US regulation says that if your manufacturing process or your materials or your equipment involved US contents, that includes software and hardware owned by US companies, you will be subject to the US export control regime. So ASML being a wholly owned Netherlands company, they need a number of US-based patents as part of their production. And that qualifies ASML as being subject to the US export control. Similarly, for Nikon and Canon, they are also subject to the US export control because of the similar requirements.
And TSMC.
TSMC as well, right? So that's the first background why these foreign companies needs to negotiate or discuss at least with the U.S. authorities on collaboration, on collaborating with the export control regime. Now, ASML is complaining because ASML is, as we mentioned, enjoying a near monopoly position, especially in the advanced manufacturing equipment market. So for the last 2-3 years, the U.S. is preventing China to have effective access to those equipments necessary for moving to the next ladder. So ASML, of course, as a commercial company, was impacted by this regulation. At the same time, some of the U.S. companies, including, for example, Applied Materials, who are also the major supplier of advanced materials for chips manufacturing, continue to supply. So I think that's one of the examples ASML is complaining about. I think at the end of the day, most of these companies will be working together with the U.S., given the fact that a large share of the contracts come from still U.S.-based companies. So it still matters for them to work with their clients to maintain the trust, especially the trust between the government behind those major clients.
Yeah, basically you're saying that U.S. is more important than China at the end of the day.
That's right. But as a commercial company, I think all these companies are also responsible for their investors, for their shareholders. So I think they are telling the government that maybe some kind of compensatory arrangements are needed for preventing these commercial companies to pursue their revenue maximizing strategies because they work together to follow these regulatory requirements.
And perhaps their governments have listened because, the Dutch government, as well as the Japanese government, said that they agreed in principle with the export controls. And the Dutch minister said that they would not be following the US word for word. So in your view, what does that mean? Does that mean some products will still be sold to China?
I think it's not a surprise decision for both the Netherlands and Japanese governments, because the U.S. remains to be the most important strategic or defense partner for the two countries, right? So they have reached this agreement in principle, suggesting that they have agreed on the general directions on, for example, to encourage companies to collaborate with the U.S. authorities on these implementing export control requirements. So, but when they reach an agreement in principle, also suggests that there are many details that are yet to be decided, right? And what the Dutch minister is indicating is that they will not agree on they will not implement the export control as if they were U.S. companies.
But what details are we talking about?
Right. Now, the U.S. export control regime, every country, including Taiwan, have export control regimes in place. The original idea is that through this export control regime, we regulate products or inputs that have dual use nature. That means products or technology that can be used for both commercial purposes and also for weaponry developments. So the original concept is to ensure that, for example, weapon of mass destructions will be prevented through this export control of the intermediate inputs that are needed. Also, later on, the concept of anti-terrorism objective is added also to the export control regime. That's what Taiwan is implementing. I think that's also the export control regime in Japan and the Netherlands. Now, interestingly, in 2018, the US actually reformed its export control system. So they now incorporate national security concepts or national security factors as criteria for the US to decide our export control decisions. So some of the examples given in the reform package includes inconsistency with the U.S. diplomatic interest, or undermining the U.S. leadership in defense industry base, or undermining the U.S. general industrial policy. So for many countries, that's not defined as the rational or as the legal objective for them to pursue export or to implement export control regime. So I think there will be tension between the Dutch government or the Japanese government with the U.S. because these countries have different definitions on what's being qualified as the subject of export control regime. So that's one of the sources of tension. Secondly, the U.S. is sorry.
But would you agree that the Dutch being a democracy, a Western democracy, Japan being a U.S. treaty ally, that they might actually have similar defense security position in relation to China?
That's the second source of tension, right? Inconsistent with the U.S. I mean, these countries might have share some consensus on the so-called strategic or diplomatic interests, but they have divergence and different views, right? So inconsistency with the U.S. diplomatic interest not necessarily is also inconsistent with the Dutch or the Japanese foreign policy interests, right? So that's also the tension. Finally, it's the commercial business side. How are we going to compensate the loss of those private companies? I think there will be also need further discussions.
Okay, so still to come in the show. This is a preview of Apple's much-awaited augmented reality glasses. Could TSMC and Apple edge out their rival, Samsung, with their cutting-edge partnership? But first, China has hit back at US chip export controls with a massive stimulus bill of its own, valued at $143 billion over 5 years. To accelerate semiconductor self-reliance, Beijing will offer subsidies and tax credits to boost production and research in China. The majority of the financial assistance will be used to subsidize the purchases of domestic semiconductor equipment by PRC firms, mainly fabs. Professor Lee, let's compare China's $143 billion chip stimulus package with the US's Chips and Science Act, which is the $52 billion towards the chips.
Well, I think, of course, China has already spent $65 billion in the last 10 years trying to create a so-called domestic autonomous semiconductor sector. But now everybody knows that China has already achieved some significant milestones. Now China is one of the dominant leading players for matured manufacturing of semiconductors. But in terms of technology, they still face a lot of hurdles and bottlenecks. And also the capacity is yet to meet the demand. Last year, China's domestically produced chips only is able to meet about 16% of the demand in Chinese market. And out of these 16, 6% come from Samsung and TSMC. So pure Chinese companies' capacity is only able to meet 10% of the demand. Now the target of this $65 billion original stimulus package is to reach 40% self-sufficiency by the year 2025. And now it's just 10%. So I think that's the first reason that China sees this lagging behind problem. It's way behind its original target of 40%. It's now only 10%. So they want to accelerate the upscaling and doubling down on the capacities. Let's put technology bottlenecks aside for the time being. Let's focus on creating a capacity that is self-sufficient. At least we need to catch up to close to this 40% self-sufficiency level. Maybe beyond 2025, but let's start the process now. So I think that's the first objective. For that regard, I think it's quite possible because, for example, U.S. export control regime are not applied to those matured nodes of manufacturing. So China still have access to all the materials and equipment and technologies needed for China to accelerate this expansion of capacity objectives. Right? And also China is already enjoying one of the largest production base and ecosystem of chip manufacturing for the unregulated, matured segment of the sector. So considering all these factors, I think China has a high chance to achieve that. Now let's put the technology bottlenecks back to the equation. I think China will be facing increasingly difficult obstacles to access to those technology and resources for China to overcome and address these bottleneck problems.
So you're saying that you believe China's goals is actually just about self-sufficiency, as in to meet the demands of its own market.
That's the short-term objective. That's one of the objectives. China have many objectives. In addition to this self-sufficient level, the second, probably even more important objective is to overcome the so-called technology bottlenecks.
Right.
Now, this second objective seems increasingly challenging, given this export control regime that's in place.
Right. And from the Dutch and the Japanese too.
Yes.
So you believe that they could have a chance of being successful. So this won't therefore have an impact, you would think, on the Taiwanese market?
Of course.
No.
Of course. But when the Taiwanese semiconductor sector is not only about TSMC. There are other companies, for example, UMC, the second largest contract manufacturer of chips. UMC, for the last couple of years, have given up technology upgrading strategy, and instead they are focusing on maximizing and perfection of this mature manufacturing of mature side of the sector.
So the lower end Taiwanese chip makers will lose out because they will lose the market.
They'll face increasingly stiff competition. But one thing that China is not able to get hold of is trust. UMC is not competing only with China in terms of technology and manufacturing efficiency. UMC is also one of the quality UMC enjoy in terms of advantage is trust with clients. So automakers, for example, outside China, who wants to have access to chip supplies will probably go to UMC because it is a company that is from Taiwan, is a like-minded and trusted partners, and UMC as a company is a trusted company. So this trust is probably
it's becoming increasingly important.
The technology leadership.
That's right.
Yes.
And talking about trust, the WTO, in the WTO, China is actually the subject of the greatest number of claims. Yes, of complaints. And however, China itself recently filed a complaint about the US's chip export controls. What likely success do you think it would have at the WTO?
It will have some kind of symbolic implications rather than a substantive effect. Now, the trade war between US and China that started with former President Trump, China also bring a case against those trade tariff restrictions. And actually, WTO has already made a ruling in favor of China. But it hasn't changed on the ground anything about the trade war that's continue to be in place. So it is a symbolic victory for China. It doesn't change any so-called status quo on the ground. But that said, it is still very important for China because you can see the strategy China is pursuing is actually to get at least the moral high ground that the US is the one who is derogating the rule-based system that it creates, not China, right? So that
remains to be seen the judgment, though, on the remaining cases against China at the WTO.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so now, this is the most challenging issue that everybody outside China and the US face, including Taiwan. That is a rule-based system that has been undermined by the two superpowers. China accuses the US not following the rules. But the US from day one also complains that China is the one to blame about derogating and undermining the rules, right? So I think for everybody, including Taiwan, we have to be cautious about the fallout of this great power rivalry in terms of rule-based international order.
Okay, thank you. Still to come in the show, only the second ever Taiwanese-born mayor of Cupertino. We hear her story.
When I moved into Cupertino in 1990, that's about 32 years ago, the Chinese American community was not that big. We were maybe around 30, 40%. Right now, with Asian community, that includes Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Korean, Japanese, we are actually way over 65%, close to 70%.
But first, it appears fans of augmented reality will have to wait until at least 2024 for Apple's much-anticipated AR glasses. The ultra-thin display for the glasses uses an advanced technology known as micro-OLED displays, and this is where Taiwan's TSMC comes in. Micro-OLEDs are a radically different type of display which are built directly onto chip wafers. The partnership is part of Apple's efforts to reduce dependence on its rival Samsung, the global leader in OLEDs. President Tang, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol announced that he wants to set up the South Korean version of Silicon Valley and that they want to have leadership in the semiconductor industry by 2030. Does Taiwan need to be concerned?
We should always be concerned about our competitors. But the problem is that there will be some cultural difference between TSMC and Samsung. Samsung used to be very competitive. Whenever they want to enter a new area, they set objective. We want to be number one in 5 years because they have such a great objective, and therefore the chances for them to reach that objective requires a very new strategy. For example, in the cell phone industry, they did that. They become number one in 5 or 10 years in the cell phone industry, but because of the time constraint, they have to rely on Google to provide the operating system. As a result, as you can see, the Samsung, the phone business from Samsung, yes, they are number one, but their profit is far, far less than Apple. So if they want to reach number one in the world in the very short period, they have to sacrifice some fundamental work. I think that's the problem with Samsung. Also, from Samsung point of view, they like to have two teams competing with each other for the same product or for the same market. Well, in some ways that might work, but in the advanced chip sector, I don't think that's going to work. You look at TSMC. TSMC is much more cooperative projects. We got a defect problem. Let's have a meeting on all the factories, okay? And then we find the defect and we change the defect. But from Samsung point of view, they're competing with each other. What does that mean? It means they don't share their knowledge because they are competing.
Are you talking about across the company?
Across the whole company. Okay. That's the way they run the business, and that's why Samsung has far behind TSMC in the advanced chip industry.
That's fascinating. Professor Lee, so let's talk about Japan now. Japan has a government-backed chip maker called Rapidus, and it is partnering with the US's IBM, and they want to make 2-nanometer chips. How likely is this venture likely to succeed?
Right, Rapidus is actually a joint venture across the board with 8 major Japanese companies, including some of the financial institutions in Japan, and of course with Japanese government backing, providing financial and other resources. So it's actually a national team of Japan. It's very ambitious.
More collaborative, more like the TSMC approach.
Yes, but the problem Japan faces is that they actually lost many of the fundamental elements of an ecosystem that support advanced manufacturing of semiconductors in the last 30 years.
Lost it to
Taiwan and South Korea. This Rapidus company is now only working with IBM. They also have a collaboration with IMEC, which is one of the leading research institute in Europe on semiconductors. So the target is ambitious, but my understanding is that Repetter's 2 nanometer project is not targeting mass production level of 2 nanometer. They are talking about specialized 2 nanometer application type of chips. So they are talking about chips that are tailor-made for specific devices or specific functions.
What kind of devices?
For example, rockets or satellites, or other, for example, low orbit navigation devices.
So for security defense purposes?
Well, not really for
necessarily?
Commercial, for example. We're talking about the next generation broadband. It's not, land-based base station type. We're talking about all these satellites on the air. So it's commercial model. But in terms of, for example, TSMC is producing advanced chips for smartphones. So we're talking about
mass production.
20 million, 30 million units. But this 2 nanometer project, at this moment, Raptors is pursuing these specialized chips. So we're talking about maybe 1 million unit. So they are adopting different strategies.
Yeah. President Tang, so would you agree there that this venture will not undercut TSMC's market?
Yes, I totally agree, because they want to adopt so-called leapfrogging industry. They don't have 5 nanometer, they want to jump to 2 nanometer. It's impossible. It's impossible, because you really have to rely on your production data from 5 nanometer chips to move to 4 nanometer, and then to 3, and then to 2, without prior experience with the generations of products.
Would they get that production data from somewhere else?
Nobody will give them the data. Who will give them the data? Only TSMC has the data.
Yes.
Without the parameters on each process, there's no way they will be able to bypass TSMC.
So is there another purpose for this announcement?
For the announcement, just say, yeah, we could do it, and that's it. Yeah, we're going to produce tiny chips. Yes, fine. But the commercialization, profitability, I don't think they will be able to deliver. Like Samsung. Samsung also claimed that they deliver 3 nanometer chips, but the yield rate is 30%. Make no commercial sense at all.
I see.
So that's the problem.
Yeah. President, just staying on Japan, can we talk about how Japan used to be the leading chip maker in the world, and what happened to them? How come they were toppled?
I think the problem is that in Taiwan we have TSMC and UMC, and TSMC has been very, very competitive over all the years, okay? And I think that Japan, they lost the government support on their chip industry. That's the first. And the second, I don't think they have the capacity to have such a huge investment into next generation chips. For example, Global Foundry. Global Foundry is supported by Arab countries. They have tons of money.
The US-based company.
US-based, Singapore-based company.
Okay.
Global Foundry used to be Charter. Okay, they have tons of money, but how come they refuse to get into 7 nanometer chip business? Well, because first, they don't have the technology. And they think even though they will be able to come in, there's no way they can compete with TSMC. So money is not the only thing, okay? But Japan does not have that kind of ambition or that kind of resolve that we really want to go for the chip industry. They have other things to do. They can go to advanced materials, they can go to healthcare, and therefore they don't have to focus on the chip industry. And that's the only thing we have, right? Yeah. So we have no way to go. The only way to go is go forward, never look back. Okay. So I think the problem with Japan I think they lost on the 14 nanometers and saying that, well, let's give up. We just cannot compete with TSMC.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today, President Tang and Professor Li. And finally, our extended interview on today's show. In the heart of Silicon Valley is the city of Cupertino, home to many of the world's largest tech giants, including Apple. Our political editor, Ralph Wang, speaks to Hong Wei, the newly elected mayor of Cupertino, who was born and raised in Taiwan. He finds out the origin story of only the second female Taiwanese American to lead the city. Let's take a look.
Mayor, both cities, Hsinchu and Cupertino, are science hubs and they're sister cities. How do you plan to further these technological and innovative cooperations between the two cities?
You know, Hsinchu City is one of Cupertino City's very first sister city. And we were so proud when it was being accepted as one of the first sister city of Cupertino. We do a lot of student exchanges, education exchanges, and cultural exchanges, not so much on technology exchanges. So every year before COVID, Hsinchu Sister City will bring students into Cupertino elementary and high schools. They will stay here for about a week to 10 days. And we will, get them into classrooms with our students and do cultural exchanges and bring them, of course, into tours. So that is one of the main purpose to be sister cities. It's more education based. Cupertino is a very education focused community. And so when we established, sister city with Hsinchu, education is one of our major goals. Of course, when I went for about, I want to say 20 years ago, when I was a school board member with our high school district, we actually went to Taiwan on the invitation of, the organizations from Hsinchu and also from Taiwan Foreign Affairs.
Do you feel that there could be more exchanges in terms of, say, IT, or given that Cupertino is a home to Apple and that Hsinchu's, the heart of the IT base, in terms of technological student exchanges?
So how we operate here is Cupertino Hsinchu Sister City has a nonprofit organization. So it depends on the board members there, what their focus are. In the past, it's been education. So I could post this question to our Cupertino Hsinchu Sister City Committee and ask them, what kind of cultural, in addition to cultural education, what kind of industry exchange we could do.
Because with TSMC's expansion in Arizona, there seems to be renewed interest, or you could say more interest in terms of technological cooperation. And of course, all of this starts from education.
I think that could be a future prospect that Cupertino City can work with the Hsinchu Sister City Committee and further expand our connections and partnership.
Cupertino is also home to one of the largest Taiwanese communities in Northern California. What are the community's specific concerns, and how do you plan to address these concerns?
When I moved into Cupertino in 1990, that's about 32 years ago, the Chinese American community was not that big. We were maybe around 30–40%. Right now, with Asian community, that includes Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Korean, Japanese, we are actually way over 65%, close to 70%. So it is a very heavily Asian populated city. When I first moved here, the foreign language department in our high school only has French, Spanish, German, and Japanese. And we added Chinese. It took a lot of efforts for the Chinese schools, Chinese community schools, to work with the school district and then and introduce the Chinese class officially into the foreign language department in the high schools. So what we have right now, so a lot of people say the American is a melting pot. I actually would not describe America as a melting pot. I describe America as a kaleidoscope, 万花筒. Every culture, every part, as this beautiful little sparkling place that makes the United States of America a beautiful kaleidoscope. So what we are doing right now in the Chinese American community and also Indian American community and Korean and Japanese, we brought our culture into Cupertino as a sparkling, beautiful place that makes this kaleidoscope of Cupertino a real beautiful place. So we each shine in our different areas, whether it's food or cultural or our tradition, principles, our ethnic dresses.
It's interesting you mentioned the concept of kaleidoscope. We feel that immigrants from Taiwan are actually increasing given that there's more cooperation in terms of technology and
Yes,
adding to that kaleidoscope.
absolutely. So it's not just education, it's also our ethnic cultural, we bring our values into it. You know, we love our families, we're more respectful to our parents. We bring that into it. And also we bring our technology.
In terms of setting policy, what are the key policies that you plan to put out?
Our goal with the new council is really to take care of residents, but there are 3 levels of residents. There are current residents who live in Cupertino. There are residents who work in Cupertino who are our day residents. There are also future residents that when we build housing, they're going to move into Cupertino. So our goal is to move Cupertino forward to serve 3 levels of residents, not just the current resident. Yes, we listen to their needs. We would, accommodate what they need, but we want to look forward to the next 50 years. And the second level is we really want to do, integrated public service, integrated public safety for not just current, because we have to look, when we build housing, we have more residents, we do have more people, and we have to have integrated public safety to make sure our infrastructure matches our growth. So that is a major part that current residents really would support. But our goal is, how do we build our infrastructure, our freeways, our exits, our sheriff's department, our fire department, to match the growth in the next 20 years or 40 or 50 years. So that is another big part of Cupertino. Actually, every city in Silicon Valley has that growth that's coming. So we are preparing for growth for the next 8 years, but we also are preparing for integrated public safety for the next 10, 20 years to match our growth. And the third level, I do believe, is being more inclusive. You talk about the Cupertino as Asian, heavily Asian, but it doesn't mean that we're inclusive. We're inclusive. It's not about just ethnic. It's about age. Are we inclusive of young people to live in Cupertino? And it's about income levels. Are we inclusive about people who work in our stores, who are our teachers, who are our staff, who clean our houses? They don't make as much money as engineers or people who have startups, but they are integral part of Cupertino. Are we inclusive enough to provide housing for them to stay in Cupertino? So inclusiveness is not just about ethnic, Asian Americans or Caucasian. It's about different income levels, different age groups, different religious beliefs. So we would love Cupertino to be a more inclusive city that encompasses different levels of, different levels of age, of working experience, of salary, and of religious beliefs, and including our LGBTQ family population. So that's what we would like Cupertino to become in the next 20 to 50 years.